the gilded cage of 19th-century London society, a wedding is not a union of hearts, but a merger of fortunes. For the newly minted Duchess of Blackwood, Rosamond Alder, the grand ceremony was the final stroke of a bargain that saved her family from ruin. Her groom, the enigmatic Duke Caspian Thorne, was a man carved from ice and shadow, his fortune as vast as his emotional distance. He had offered her his name, his title, and his protection. Everything but his heart. And as she stood before him, on their wedding night, he uttered the 5 words that would seal her fate. "I cannot love you." The bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, had a hollow ring. At least they did to Rosamond. To the throng of onlookers pressing against the wrought-iron gates, they were a joyous proclamation, a sound that affirmed the rightness of the world. The ancient and powerful House of Thorne had taken a bride. The young Duke Caspian Thorne, the most sought-after bachelor in the 3 kingdoms, was finally wed. The bride, Lady Rosamond Alder, daughter of a viscount with a fine name and empty coffers, was deemed a suitable, if uninspired, choice. From her position at the altar, Rosamond saw the union for what it was, a meticulously crafted illusion. The scent of 1,000 white roses threatened to suffocate her. The weight of the Thorne diamonds cold against her throat felt less like a gift and more like a collar. And the man beside her, the man to whom she had just pledged her life, her body and her fealty, was a stranger. Throughout the ceremony, Duke Caspian Thorne had not truly looked at her. His gaze, a startling shade of stormy grey, had been fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder, as if he were addressing a ghost in the apse. His touch, when he placed the heavy gold band on her finger, was brief and impersonal, the necessary contact of a man handling a fragile but inanimate object. He moved with a devastating grace that seemed at odds with the rigid set of his jaw and the unyielding coldness in his eyes. He was perfection, sculpted from granite and just as warm. Rosamond had known this would not be a love match. Her father, Viscount Alder, had made the terms painfully clear in his study, 6 months prior, the scent of stale brandy and desperation thick in the air. The Duke's offer is a lifeline. Rosamond, he had said, his face pale. Our debts are considerable. His generosity will restore the Alder name. Your duty is to accept it with grace. She had accepted. What choice did she have? The alternative was destitution, shame, and the ruin of her younger siblings' prospects. She was the sacrificial lamb, polished and presented to secure her family's future. She had walked into this arrangement with her eyes open, expecting courtesy, perhaps even a quiet companionship that might one day blossom from mutual respect. She had not expected this chilling void, this palpable wall of indifference that seemed to shimmer around the Duke, like heat off a winter road. The wedding breakfast was a torturous affair at the Duke's London residence. Hundreds of guests swirled through the grand ballroom, their laughter and chatter a deafening roar. Rosamond sat beside her new husband at the head table, a perfect porcelain doll of a duchess. She smiled until her cheeks ached, accepted congratulations from people whose names she instantly forgot, and sipped champagne that tasted like ash. Caspian played his part with unnerving precision. He was courteous, attentive, in a public-facing way, his hand resting on the small of her back as they greeted guests, a possessive gesture that felt utterly devoid of possession. He was the perfect picture of a powerful man who had acquired a beautiful new asset. But when a moment of privacy arose, when no one was looking, the mask would drop. His eyes would become distant. His hand would retreat, and the temperature around them would plummet by 10 degrees. Their journey to Thorncliffe Manor, the Duke's ancestral seat in the north, was conducted in a silence more profound than any she had ever known. The carriage sprung and upholstered in the finest leather, jolted along the rutted country roads. Rosamond sat opposite Caspian, her hands clenched in the lap of her travelling gown. She watched the verdant English countryside roll by a blur of green and gold, trying to focus on anything but the man in front of her. He didn't read. He didn't speak. He simply watched the same passing scenery, his profile sharp and aristocratic against the window. What was he thinking? Was he regretting the bargain? Did he find her so repulsive? She had been told she was pretty with her auburn hair and quiet disposition. She was educated, well-mannered, and above all compliant. She was everything a high-born wife was supposed to be. So why the cold, visceral rejection? They arrived at Thorncliffe as dusk bled across the sky in hues of violet and rose. The manor was a Gothic masterpiece of grey stone and sprawling ivy, its turrets piercing the twilight. It was magnificent and intimidating, a fortress built to keep the world out. As the carriage rolled to a stop, a line of servants led by a stern, silver-haired butler stood waiting on the steps. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "Welcome, Your Grace," the butler, Mr. Hemlock intoned, bowing low. His eyes flickered towards Rosamond for a fraction of a second, his expression unreadable. Caspian nodded curtly. "Hemlock, see to the Duchess's things. She will take the East Wing chambers." The East Wing. Rosamond knew enough about aristocratic homes to understand the implication. The master's chambers were in the West Wing. It was a public declaration of separation before she had even crossed the threshold. A cold dread, heavier than the thorn diamonds, settled deep in her bones. Later, after a solitary meal she barely touched, served in an opulent dining room designed for 60, she was led to her rooms. They were beautiful, of course. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, the furniture was exquisite, and a cavernous four-poster bed was draped in heavy silk. It was a luxurious prison. She was dismissing her new lady's maid when the door opened without a knock. Caspian stood there, a dark silhouette against the candlelight of the hallway. He was no longer in his formal wedding attire, but a simple black frock coat and trousers which somehow made him seem even more imposing. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the silent room. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, his grey eyes finally meeting hers directly, and they were filled with an emotion she couldn't name. Not hatred, not anger, but a profound and weary resignation. I believe he began his voice, a low, smooth baritone that held no warmth. "It is best we establish the terms of our arrangement from the outset." Rosamond stiffened her hands, folded before her. Arrangement. "This marriage," he clarified, his tone clipped. "You have my name, my protection. Your family is financially secure. In return, I require an heir. Beyond the duties that necessity entails, I expect nothing from you, and you in turn shall expect nothing from me." The bluntness of his words was like a physical blow. She had known, but to hear it stated so plainly, so coldly, was another thing entirely. She lifted her chin, a flicker of older pride, refusing to be extinguished. "I am aware of my duty, Your Grace." He gave a slight, humorless nod. He took a step forward, and for a wild moment she thought he might touch her. Instead, he stopped several feet away, his expression hardening into something unreadable. "I want to be unequivocally clear, so that there are no maidenly delusions or future misunderstandings. Your presence here is a matter of contract. I will be a civil and accommodating husband in all public and practical matters. But that is the limit. Do you understand?" She swallowed her throat tight. "I do." He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were peeling back the layers of her soul, looking for a weakness. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. "Good," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound of utter finality. "Because I cannot love you." He said the words, "I cannot love you," and then he turned and left. The heavy oak door closed with a soft, definitive thud, a sound that sealed the tomb of her hopes. Rosamond stood frozen in the centre of the vast bedchamber, the firelight flickering over the silk of her nightgown. The air grew thick and heavy, each tick of the mantel clock a hammer blow against the anvil of her silence. She had been prepared for a loveless marriage. She had been prepared for duty for distance, for a life lived in parallel to her husband's. She had not been prepared for the sheer, brutal finality of his declaration. It was not a warning or a preference. It was stated as an irrevocable fact, a law of nature as certain as gravity. I cannot. Not I will not. The distinction was a chasm. For a long while she did nothing. She forced herself to breathe, drawing in the unfamiliar scent of beeswax and old stone. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. She was the mistress of Thorncliffe. She had a role to play, and collapsing into a heap of feminine hysterics was not in the script. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Your duty is to accept it with grace. Grace. She would be graceful. She would be the perfect, untouchable duchess he seemed to desire. An elegant piece of decor for his ancient home. She walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy velvet curtain. Outside, a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, illuminating the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks that dotted the parkland. The view was beautiful, desolate and vast, just like her future. A single tear escaped hot and surprising, tracing a path down her cold cheek. She swiped it away with an angry flick of her fingers. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction even in absentia. Crying was for heartbroken girls, and her heart wasn't broken. How could it be she didn't know him? She didn't love him. But the tears were not for the loss of Caspian Thorn's love. They were for the loss of the possibility of love for the young girl who had once dreamed of a kind hand in hers, of shared laughter and whispered secrets. They were for the death of a hope she hadn't even realized she was still clutching until he had pried her fingers from it. They were tears of humiliation for being sold, and then told her value extended only to her womb. They were tears of fear for the long, empty years stretching out before her in this cold, magnificent house with its cold, magnificent master. The dam of her composure, so carefully constructed over months of silent acquiescence, began to crack. Another tear followed the first, and then another. Her throat constricted, and a sound half-sob, half-gasp escaped her lips. She pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle it, her shoulders beginning to shake. She stumbled away from the window, away from the hauntingly bleak landscape, and sank onto the edge of the enormous empty bed. The silk felt cold beneath her. Here in the oppressive silence of her gilded cage, the grace her father had demanded felt like an impossible burden. The stoicism she had worn like armor fell away piece by piece. The sobs came then quiet and agonizing at first, then racking and uncontrollable. She curled into a ball, burying her face in the heavy duvet, muffling the sounds of her own unraveling. Each gasp for air was a fresh wave of despair. She cried for her lost home, for the familiar faces of her siblings, for the life she might have had if she had been born with a fortune instead of a title. She cried for the utter profound loneliness that had just become her permanent companion. In the West Wing, Caspian Thorn stood before his own hearth, a glass of brandy in his hand. He had done what was necessary. He had set the boundaries. It was crueler to allow hope to fester than to excise it quickly. He knew this, It was a lesson he had learned long ago, etched into his very being. Protect them by keeping them away. A wife was a vulnerability he could not afford, but an heir was a duty he could not shirk. Rosamond Alder. No, Rosamond Thorne was simply a means to that end. A beautiful, quiet, and hopefully resilient means. He had seen the flicker of pride in her eyes when she had answered him. Good. She had spirit. She would need it. He tossed back the brandy, the burn in his throat, a welcome distraction from the faint, unpleasant churning in his gut. He had delivered the line with the cold precision he had practiced in his mind, yet the memory of her wide, startled eyes, the color of moss after a rain, lingered. He set the glass down and realized his signet ring was missing, the heavy gold ring bearing the thorn crest, the one he never removed. He must have left it on the washstand when he'd prepared for bed. With a sigh of irritation, he turned and strode from the room, his footsteps silent on the thick corridor carpets. He did not expect to return to her chambers, not tonight. The duties of the marriage bed could wait. Tonight was for establishing the rules. He reached the door to the East Wing chambers and pushed it open without thinking to knock. The room was his after all. Everything in this house was his. The scene that met his eyes stopped him cold. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting the room in long, dancing shadows. And there, curled on the edge of the vast bed, was his wife. Her body was racked with silent, shuddering sobs, her face buried in the bedclothes. The sound was muffled, but the raw, unadulterated misery of her posture was unmistakable. This was not a display of feminine theatrics. This was the sound of a soul breaking. He had expected tears, perhaps. Quiet, dignified weeping into a lace handkerchief. He had been prepared for that. He was not prepared for this raw, guttural grief. It was too real, too vulnerable. In London at the wedding, she had been an object, the bride, the Duchess. A beautiful, serene woman playing a part. But this creature, shaking with silent sobs in the near darkness, was just a girl. A girl he had cornered and systematically dismantled. For the first time that day, he truly saw her. He saw the slender line of her back, the way her auburn hair, now freed from its intricate coiffure, spilled like liquid fire over the dark silk. He saw a person, not a contract, a person whose pain was a direct result of his words, his actions. An unfamiliar, deeply uncomfortable sensation twisted inside his chest. It was not pity. Pity was a sentiment he disdained. It was a pang, a sharp, resonant ache of something akin to guilt, but sharper, more personal. He had built his walls so high to protect others from the danger that shadowed him, but in doing so, he had become a source of pain himself. He was a monster who created misery to prevent a greater one. He stood there in the doorway, a ghost in his own home, watching her cry. He should leave. He should retrieve his ring from the washstand and retreat to his own wing, allowing her the privacy of her grief. That was the logical, sensible thing to do. That was the plan. But his feet wouldn't move. He was mesmerized by the tragic poetry of the scene. The sight of her so utterly broken on their wedding night chipped away at the ice he had so carefully cultivated around his heart. He had told her he could not love her. He believed it to be true. It had to be true. But as he watched her small frame tremble with a sorrow he had inflicted, he felt the first terrifying tremor of a lie. The vow he had made to himself, the cold certainty that had been his shield for years, suddenly felt fragile, thin as glass. The signet ring lay forgotten on the marble washstand across the room. Caspian Thorne, the Duke of Blackwood, quietly closed the door and retreated, leaving it behind. The days that followed fell into a rigid and hollow routine. Rosamond rose dressed and took her breakfast alone in a sun-drenched morning room overlooking the formal gardens. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she would act the part. The tears of her wedding night were locked away, a secret shame she refused to acknowledge even to herself. She spent her mornings meeting with Mrs. Gable, the stout and efficient housekeeper, learning the intricate workings of the vast estate. She reviewed ledgers, approved menus, and discussed the needs of the staff with a calm and distant authority that belied the turmoil within her. Caspian was a phantom. She would see him at dinner, a formal and excruciatingly silent affair held in the cavernous dining hall. They would sit at opposite ends of a table that could seat 30, the flickering candelabra between them, a constellation of unreachable stars. Mr. Hemlock and the footman would serve the courses with practiced invisibility. Caspian would inquire after her day with the same detached courtesy he might offer a visiting dignitary. "Was your meeting with the housekeeper satisfactory?" "Madam, yes, your grace. Mrs. Gable is most thorough." "Good. Is there anything you require?" "No, your grace. I am quite comfortable." The conversation never strayed beyond such pleasantries. His grey eyes would meet hers across the expanse of polished mahogany, and she would see nothing but a carefully guarded emptiness. After the meal he would give a slight bow and retreat to his study, the library or some other part of the house she had not yet been invited to see. He had not returned to her chambers. The duties of the marriage bed and the air he claimed to require remained an unspoken, looming dread. Rosamond found her solace in exploring Thorncliffe Manor. The house was a labyrinth of history, each portrait-lined corridor and dust-moated room telling a story. She discovered the library, a 2-story cathedral of books, and spent hours there, losing herself in worlds far removed from her own. The staff watched her with wary curiosity. She was polite fare, and didn't put on airs which they appreciated. But she was also the Duke's wife, and the Duke was a man who kept his secrets buried deep. They treated her with a cautious deference, their loyalty sworn first and foremost to the cold, solitary man who was their master. It was a young housemaid, named Beatrice, who first spoke the name that haunted the halls. Beatrice was barely 16, with a cheerful, guileless face and a tendency to chatter. One afternoon, while dusting a collection of porcelain figures in the long gallery, she saw Rosamond staring at a particular portrait. It was different from the others. While most portraits depicted stern, bewigged thorns of centuries past, this one was of a young woman. She was beautiful with Caspian's dark hair and a smile that was both radiant and melancholic. But it was her eyes, the same stormy grey as the Duke's, that held Rosamond's attention. They were full of a vibrant, rebellious light that seemed entirely out of place in the sombre gallery. "That's Lady Lenora, Beatrice," whispered her voice, soft with reverence. Rosamond turned, surprised. "Lady Lenora, the Duke's sister." "Your Grace, Beatrice," explained her duster, momentarily forgotten. She passed ever so young. Some say the Duke's never been the same since. They were as close as twins, him and her. A sister. The information settled in Rosamond's mind, rearranging the pieces of the puzzle. How did she die? Beatrice's cheerful face clouded over. She glanced nervously down the hall, as if expecting Mr. Hemlock to materialize from the shadows. "It was a tragedy, Your Grace. A riding accident," they said. "Her horse bolted near the cliffs. Happened 5 years ago. The Duke was the one who found her. He locked himself away for a month after. When he came out, he was as you see him now." The story resonated with a painful clarity, a lost love. Of course, it was the most classic and tragic of explanations. Caspian wasn't incapable of love. His heart was simply already given, entombed with his beloved sister. His coldness wasn't a rejection of Rosamond personally, but a shield to protect a wound that would not heal. It explained the raw grief she sensed behind the granite facade, the profound weariness in his eyes. He had loved so fiercely once that he had nothing left to give. A strange sense of relief washed over Rosamond, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. She was relieved that his coldness wasn't her fault, that there was a reason beyond her own inadequacy. But she was also trespassing on a private, sacred sorrow. The ghost of Lenora Thorne was the true mistress of this house. Rosamond was merely a placeholder, a necessity. That evening at dinner she looked at Caspian with new eyes. She saw the subtle lines of pain etched around his mouth, the way his gaze would sometimes drift towards the empty chair beside him. She saw a man drowning in a grief so profound he could not bear to let anyone near enough to see. Her own loneliness suddenly felt less acute, eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of his. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to offer some small measure of solace. It was an absurd impulse. He had made it clear he wanted nothing from her. But the human desire to connect, to soothe a fellow creature's pain, was a powerful one. "I was in the long gallery today," she began, her voice quiet but clear across the long table. "I saw the portrait of your sister. She was very beautiful." Caspian froze his wine glass halfway to his lips. Every muscle in his body seemed to tense. The air grew cold, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. He slowly lowered the glass, his knuckles white. "Do not speak of her," he said. His voice was dangerously low, a lethal whisper that held more menace than any shout. Rosamond's breath caught. She had miscalculated, trespassed on hallowed ground. "I apologize, Your Grace. I did not mean to cause offense. You will not mention her name again," he commanded, his grey eyes now chips of ice. "Is that understood?" "Yes," she whispered, her gaze dropping to her plate. The rest of the meal passed in a silence so thick and heavy it was nearly unbearable. The moment he was finished, Caspian rose from his chair, threw his napkin onto the table, and strode from the room without another word, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silent hall. Rosamond was left alone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had tried to build a bridge, however small, and he had burned it to the ground. He was not just grieving, he was guarding that grief with a feral intensity. The ghost of Lenora was not a sad memory. She was a fortress, and her name was the key to a gate Caspian would rather die than open. Rosamond realized then that her situation was far more complex than a simple, loveless marriage. She was married to a man who was actively, violently pushing her away. To survive in this house, she would have to learn its secrets. But to learn its secrets, she would have to get closer to Caspian. And Caspian Thorne had just made it terrifyingly clear that he would never let that happen. The ghost of Blackwood Hall was more present, more powerful than the living, breathing Duchess, and Rosamond had no idea how to compete with a memory. Weeks turned into a month. The initial chill of autumn deepened, stripping the leaves from the oaks and leaving their skeletal branches stark against a perpetually grey sky. Rosamond settled into the rhythm of Thorncliffe, a life of quiet observation and lonely pursuits. She learned the names of the tenants, the yield of the home farm's crops, and the winding paths of the estate's vast woodlands. She was a duchess in title, but a ghost in practice, drifting through the grand rooms her presence acknowledged, but never truly felt. The wall between her and Caspian remained absolute. After her disastrous mention of Lenora, he seemed to retreat even further into himself. Their dinners became shorter, their incidental encounters in the hallways more strained. He was a polite, cold stranger who shared her roof. The matter of the air remained unaddressed, a silent, ticking clock between them. Rosamond was perversely grateful for the reprieve, yet terrified of the inevitable summons. The shift began not with a personal overture, but with a practical crisis. One morning, Mr. Hemlock requested a meeting with the Duke in his study, and to Rosamond's surprise, Caspian sent a footman to request her presence as well. It was the first time she had ever been invited into his private domain. The study was a reflection of its owner, masculine, orderly, and intimidating. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, shelves overflowed with leather-bound books, and a massive mahogany desk stood before a window, overlooking the wind-swept moors. Caspian stood by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel. Mr. Hemlock stood near the desk, his expression grim. "Your Grace," the butler began, nodding to Rosamond as she entered. "A matter has arisen concerning the tenant farms on the western parcels. Mr. Davies from Millwood Farm reports that a portion of his flock has taken ill and died. He suspects the stream on his land has been fouled." Caspian's brow furrowed. "Fouled how he is not certain," Your Grace Hemlock replied. "But he says the water runs down from the lands belonging to Lord Fletcher." Rosamond knew the name. Lord Geoffrey Fletcher was their nearest neighbour, a man whose lands bordered the Thorn estate to the west. She had seen him once, from a distance, a stout, florid man with a reputation for ruthless ambition. Fletcher Caspian said the name a curse on his lips. "I have no doubt he is involved. He has been trying to force me to sell that parcel for years. He wants the water rights." "Davies is a good man with a young family," Hemlock added quietly. "Losing half his flock will ruin him." Caspian's jaw tightened. He turned to pace before the fire, the very picture of contained frustration. "I will send a man to take samples from the stream, but proving Fletcher is behind it will be another matter. He is slippery as an eel and twice as venomous." Rosamond listened quietly. She had spent the last week reviewing the estate ledgers and maps in the library, a self-appointed task to combat her own crushing boredom. An image of the maps she had studied flashed in her mind. "The stream on the Davies farm," she said, her voice unexpectedly clear in the tense room. "Does it not originate from the old quarry spring?" Both men turned to look at her. Caspian's expression was one of mild surprise that she had spoken at all. "It does," Your Grace Hemlock confirmed. "And the quarry," she continued, thinking aloud, "is on Lord Fletcher's land now. But the maps from the last century show it as part of the Thorn estate. It was ceded in a boundary dispute in my great-grandfather's time." Caspian stopped pacing. He looked at her, truly looked at her with an expression of sharp, analytical interest. "Your point, my point. Your Grace is that while Lord Fletcher may own the land, the Thorn estate may still hold mineral and water rights to the quarry itself, depending on the wording of the original transfer agreement. If he is deliberately poisoning a water source to which we have a legal claim, it is a far more serious offence than simple nuisance." A slow silence descended on the room. Mr. Hemlock's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, a wild display of emotion for him. Caspian stared at Rosamond, his grey eyes narrowed in thought. He hadn't considered that. He had been so focused on the present aggression that he hadn't thought to delve into the archives. "The estate archives are in the library in the south alcove," he said, his tone no longer dismissive, but sharp with purpose. "Find the original deed of transfer. From 1812, I believe. It was a command, but it was also an invitation, an acknowledgement of her contribution." For the first time, he was not speaking to her as a wife or a woman, but as an intelligent individual. A spark of something pride-purpose ignited within her. For the next 2 days, the library became their shared territory. Rosamond, with her smaller hands and patience for delicate crumbling parchment, worked her way through the dusty deed boxes. Caspian worked beside her, poring over old legal texts and precedents. They spoke little, but it was a comfortable working silence, a world away from the strained emptiness of their dinners. She would hand him a document, their fingers brushing, and a jolt of unexpected awareness would pass between them. He would point out a passage, his deep voice explaining a complex legal point, and she would find herself captivated by the sharp intelligence in his eyes. She saw a different side of him here, amongst the books and the history of his family. She saw the Duke, the protector of his land and people. She saw the immense weight of the responsibility he carried and the sharp, formidable mind he used to carry it. He was not just a grieving man. He was a warrior defending his legacy. On the third day, she found it. A fragile, ribbon-tied scroll, the deed of transfer for the quarry lands, and there in faded ink was the clause she had hoped for. The rights to all waters originating from the quarry spring, and access thereto, shall be retained in perpetuity by the Thorn estate and its heirs. She held it out to him, her heart thrumming. "I believe this is what you are looking for." He took the document, his eyes scanning the archaic script. A slow, wolfish smile, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, spread across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes, and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before tragedy remade him. "Rosamond," he said, and the sound of her given name spoken in that low baritone sent a shiver down her spine. "This is more than I could have hoped for. This is not a shield. This is a sword." That evening, armed with incontrovertible proof, Caspian rode to Lord Fletcher's estate. He returned 2 hours later, his expression grim but satisfied. At dinner, the silence was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken energy of their shared victory. "Fletcher will be compensating Davies for his losses," Caspian announced, breaking the quiet, "and a new channel will be dug to divert the spring water away from the quarry entirely." At his expense. "That is good news," Rosamond said, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "It is," he agreed. He looked at her across the table, his gaze direct and assessing. "Your contribution was invaluable. You have a keen mind, Your Grace." The formal title was back, but the tone was different. It held a new respect. It was a small thing, a crack in the glacier, but it felt momentous. She had earned a glimpse behind the wall. The fragile, unexpected alliance they had formed over dusty maps and legal deeds felt more intimate, more real than any forced pleasantry or public display of possession. She had come to Thorncliffe as a contracted broodmare, but she had just proven herself to be a partner, and in the calculating grey eyes of her husband, she saw a flicker of something new, grudging, surprised, and undeniable respect. The victory over Lord Fletcher thawed the permafrost between them, but it did not melt it entirely. A cautious truce settled over Thorncliffe. Their dinners became less of an ordeal, occasionally punctuated by conversations about estate matters. Caspian began to actively seek her opinion on tenant leases and agricultural plans. He listened to her, truly listened, and she found a surprising satisfaction in being his partner, his duchess, in fact, as well as in name. Yet the personal distance remained. The East Wing and West Wing were still separate worlds. The ghost of his sister Lenora still stood between them, a silent sentinel guarding the path to his heart. Rosamond, emboldened by their newfound alliance, but still wary of his temper, resolved to understand the true depth of his grief. She felt that if she could only comprehend the nature of the wound, she might learn how to navigate its jagged edges. Her search for answers led her to a disused wing in the northern part of the manor. Beatrice had mentioned it was where the family's personal effects were often stored. It was a place of dust and memories, filled with shrouded furniture and forgotten relics. In a small locked room at the end of a corridor, she found a collection of old trunks. One made of dark, scarred leather bore the initials CT. Her heart pounded as she worked the rusty lock with a hairpin, feeling like a common thief. But the need to understand was a physical ache. The trunk was not full of clothes or keepsakes, but journals. Dozens of them, bound in worn leather, filled with a strong, sloping script. They were Caspian's. She hesitated, her conscience warring with her curiosity. This was the ultimate invasion of his privacy, but the memory of his raw pain and the wall he had built because of it spurred her on. She took one of the oldest-looking journals and retreated to the privacy of her room, her hands trembling. She didn't find what she expected. There were no lovelorn passages about a beautiful woman, no tortured entries about unrequited passion. The early journals were those of a serious, intelligent young man, deeply devoted to his family and his duty. He wrote of his studies at Oxford, his political debates, and his deep affection for his younger sister, Leonora. He described her as a blinding light, reckless and brilliant, and the only person who truly understands the cage of our birth. There was love, yes, but it was the deep, protective love of a brother. The tone of the journals began to change about 7 years ago. The entries grew darker, more secretive. He wrote of his father, the previous duke, growing increasingly withdrawn and paranoid. "Father is consumed by it," one entry read. "He speaks of the thorn debt, as if it were a living thing, a beast that stalks our family. He says Fletcher's grandfather set the trap and we have been struggling in its jaws ever since. He will not explain it to me. He only says that to be a thorn is to be born with a noose around your neck. The thorn debt. Lord Fletcher." The pieces began to connect in a way she hadn't anticipated. This was not a story of lost love. This was something far older, far more dangerous. She continued to read, her dread mounting with every page. Then she found the entry from the night his father died. He is gone. Not by illness, but by his own hand. I found him in the study. He left a letter. The truth is worse than any nightmare. The debt is real. Our great-grandfather, a gambling fool, did not just lose land to the Fletchers. He lost our honor. He signed a treasonous document, a confession, to a plot against the crown, which Fletcher's ancestor orchestrated and then used for blackmail. The document is false, but it bears his seal. For 3 generations, the Fletchers have held it over us. They do not want money. They demand political favors, insider information, our family's influence used for their sordid gains. We are puppets, and they pull the strings. My father tried to find a way out. He tried to appeal to an old friend in the government, and Fletcher learned of it. He threatened to release the document. The shame was too much for my father to bear. Rosamond had to put the journal down her hands, shaking. The cold, aloof Duke, the powerful master of Thorncliffe, was a prisoner. His entire life had been dictated by this horrifying secret. His inheritance was not a fortune, but a generational curse of blackmail and servitude. She picked up another journal, one from the year of Leonora's death. The entries were sparse, filled with a clipped, desperate anguish. Leonora knows. I do not know how, but she found Father's letter. She confronts me, her eyes full of fire. She says we must fight. She will not live as a slave to the Fletchers. She says she would rather die than bend her knee to that pig, Geoffrey. I told her it is impossible, that to fight is to bring ruin upon us all. We argued, the worst argument of our lives. The final entry before a long gap of silence was almost illegible, the ink smudged as if by tears. They said it was a riding accident. They said her horse bolted. But I know better. I saw her face that morning. It was not the face of a girl going for a ride. It was the face of a soldier marching into a battle she knew she could not win. She rode to Fletcher's lands, to confront him, to get the document I do not know. But she didn't come back. Fletcher claims she fell from the cliffs, a tragic accident. He lies. He killed her, or he drove her to her death. And it is my fault. I should have listened. I should have fought with her. I chose caution. I chose disgrace over death, and my choice killed her. The truth crashed down on Rosamond with the force of a physical blow. Lenora was not his lost love. She was his greatest failure. His grief was not just sorrow, it was a soul-crushing guilt. His declaration on their wedding night, "I cannot love you," was not about a lack of affection. It was a vow. It was a desperate attempt to protect her. To love someone, to bring them into the heart of his life, was to paint a target on their back. His coldness, his distance, it was all a shield, not for himself, but for her. He was trying to save her from the same fate that had befallen his father and his sister. The man she thought she knew, the cold, unfeeling Duke, vanished, replaced by the image of a man trapped in an impossible situation, haunted by ghosts of his own making, desperately trying to protect the innocent from the fallout of his family's ancient sin. He was a prisoner playing the part of a king. She closed the journal, her heart aching, with a profound, gut-wrenching empathy. Her own loneliness seemed trivial in the face of his lifelong torment. The wall between them was not made of ice. It was forged from love and guilt. She returned the journal to the trunk, her mind racing. She understood now. She understood everything. The constant pressure from Lord Fletcher, the poisoned sheep. It was all part of the long, cruel game of control. Caspian fought back in small ways, as he had with the water rights, winning minor skirmishes in a war he believed he could never win. Her perspective shifted entirely. She was not his adversary or a mere contractual partner. She was his wife, and the vow she had made at the altar, in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, suddenly took on a new, profound meaning. His sickness was this secret. His poverty was this crushing debt of honor. She walked back to her chambers, no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage, but a woman with a purpose. Caspian believed he had to fight this battle alone. He believed that to let her in was to condemn her. He was wrong. She was not another vulnerability. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she would not stand by while her husband, her house, and her future were held hostage by the sins of the past. She would become the ally he never knew he needed. Knowing the truth of Caspian's burden, Rosamond saw his every action in a new light. His clipped words were a shield, his distance a desperate act of protection. She subtly challenged his isolation, not with emotional demands, but with quiet competence. By immersing herself in the estate's affairs, she proved herself a capable partner, a duchess in fact, as well as in name. Caspian watched her with a mixture of admiration and fear. He had intended to keep her safe in her ignorance, but her intelligence drew her ever closer to the center of his dangerous world. The inevitable confrontation arrived with a letter bearing Lord Fletcher's seal. Rosamond was in the study with Caspian when it was delivered. As he read it, the brief camaraderie they had built vanished. A mask of pure ice descended over his features, and he crumpled the letter in his fist. "Leave me," he commanded, his voice tight with a cold, lethal fury. This was the moment. Rosamond stood her ground. "No," she said, her voice firm. She moved to stand before him, meeting his blazing eyes. "I am your wife, Caspian. Whatever shadow hangs over this house, it hangs over me too. Stop trying to protect me by shutting me out. Let me help you." His control shattered. "Help me," he snarled. "You cannot begin to comprehend the filth my family is mired in. The only way I can protect you is by ensuring you know nothing, like Lenora." The name was a sharp, deliberate strike. His face went ashen. "She tried to fight him, didn't she?" Rosamond pressed on her voice, softening with empathy. "You tried to protect her by telling her to be passive, and you've blamed yourself for her death ever since. You are making the same mistake with me. I will not hide in my chambers while a monster devours my husband's soul." Stunned into silence, he could only stare as fury gave way to horrified understanding. "How?" "I know about the debt," she said softly. "I know about the treasonous document. I know everything." The confession broke him. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands in utter defeat. "You were never supposed to know," he mumbled. "My one duty was to keep you safe." Rosamond knelt before him. "You haven't failed," she said gently. "You've been trying to carry a mountain alone. What does Fletcher want?" He raised his haunted eyes and smoothed the crumpled letter. "A vote in the House of Lords, a munitions contract for a company Fletcher controls. Their work is shoddy. To approve it would endanger the lives of our soldiers. If I refuse, he'll send the document branding my family as traitors to the Home Secretary. We'll be ruined." It was the checkmate he had dreaded his entire life. But Rosamond's mind was already racing, shifting from defence to attack. "My mother's cousin is General Sir William Pembroke," she said, an idea sparking. "He's on the Army Procurement Board and detests corruption. We have no proof of the blackmail, but what if we could give him proof of Fletcher's current treasonous intent?" For hours they talked, a new and powerful alliance forming between them. A dangerous, audacious plan took shape. As they plotted, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He took her hand, his grip warm and firm, a man clinging to a lifeline. "This is incredibly dangerous, Rosamond," he said, his voice raw. "It will not go wrong," she replied, her gaze steady. "He has underestimated you for years, Caspian, and now he has underestimated me. That will be his downfall. In that moment, they were no longer just Duke and Duchess, but partners in a gambit for their very future." The London ball was the stage for their audacious gambit. While Rosamond secured the aid of her cousin General Pembroke, convincing him to hide within earshot, Caspian lured a triumphant Lord Fletcher into the glass conservatory. Believing he had finally broken the Duke, Fletcher gloated explicitly, detailing his demands for the treasonous munitions vote. "Your sister had a foolish, reckless spirit," he sneered, twisting the knife of Caspian's deepest wound. "A tragic accident, her fall." Just then, General Pembroke emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury. "I heard everything, Lord Fletcher," he announced, as two guards stepped forward. "You are under arrest." With Fletcher's downfall, the blackmail document was burned in the study fireplace, its ashes signaling the end of a generational curse. The Thorn debt was paid. That night, back at Thorncliffe, Caspian came to her chambers, the walls between them finally gone. He confessed his declaration on their wedding night was the greatest lie he had ever told, a desperate, twisted attempt to protect her born from the crushing guilt he carried over Lenora. Taking her hands, he told her she was not a vulnerability, but his greatest strength, the woman who had saved him from himself. "I love you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. Tears of joy streaming down her face, Rosamond confessed her own love, seeing the noble heart beneath his cold armor. Their kiss was not one of duty, but a liberating promise of a future forged in fire and truth. The ghosts of Blackwood Hall finally at peace, and so the story of Caspian and Rosamond Thorn serves as a powerful reminder that the coldest walls are often built to protect the most vulnerable hearts. Theirs was a love born, not from a fairy tale romance, but from the ashes of a dark secret forged in the fires of adversity and sealed by an unbreakable alliance of mind and soul. They prove that true partnership is not about finding a perfect person, but about having the courage to see the strength within someone's perceived flaws and the love hidden behind their fear. Their journey from a cold, contractual marriage to a deep and abiding love reminds us that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones we must fight for, both with the world and with ourselves. If their story of resilience, courage, and hard-won love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a story with depth, and be sure to subscribe for more historical dramas that bring the past to life. Thank you for listening.